Hi, I'm Andrea Ludwig, Stormwater Management Specialist for the University of Tennessee Extension. We're here today to talk about rain gardens. And what better place to do so than from our very first campus rain garden built at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, right outside the UT Gardens. Here, this rain garden is capturing rooftop runoff from this building. Before we built this rain garden in 2012, this downspout was connected to a storm drain that fed that runoff straight to the Tennessee River. Now we've disconnected that downspout, and that rooftop runoff flows into our rain garden, infiltrates into the ground, and nourishes the native plants we have planted here in the rain garden. So every time it rains, this rain garden is not only helping to protect the Tennessee River from the impacts of stormwater runoff, but also year-round attracting beneficial insects and other pollinators to this space. So this is what a rain garden looks like on campus. Let's see what a rain garden could look like in your yard. So by definition, a rain garden is a small planted depression in the landscape that acts like a sponge to absorb runoff from impervious surfaces and absorb that into the ground. So we want to prioritize areas in our landscape for putting in a rain garden to be places where it's going to intercept that runoff, leaving impervious surfaces like our rooftop, our driveway, walkways, other impervious surfaces captured in a rain garden before it has a chance to travel on downhill. We also want to make sure that we have a place for excess rainwater to go, because in really big events, our rain garden is going to fill up, and then we're going to want that overflow to be safely directed into the storm drainage system. Some places to avoid in the landscape might be really close to trees. We definitely want to stay away from the root zones of our trees to make sure that we don't affect their health. We also want to avoid buried utilities or underground utilities. So we are going to need to dig out that depression, that shallow bowl in the landscape. So we want to make sure we're not digging into tree roots as well as those underground buried utilities. So calling 811 might be a step in your planning process. We also want to avoid areas that are persistently soggy or wet. So those areas are acting like seeps or springs, or perhaps just have a naturally high water table. If we add more water into that space, it's not going to be able to infiltrate into the ground, which is the key function of our rain garden here, to make sure that we have successful plant establishment and our rain garden is emptied in between those rain events, so that when the water does come, there's space in that bowl for that water to be captured. So if we're working in an area with already a high water table, we've got saturated soils, and adding more water into that area is not going to give us the infiltration that we're seeking in a rain garden. So that's a little bit about what a rain garden is, and let's talk a little bit about what a rain garden is not. So a rain garden is not an area that is just left to rewild on its own. Although I love the concept of rewilding and natural regeneration, of course, a rain garden is going to take a little bit of planning, design, and some care and maintenance along the way to make sure that it is functioning the way that it's expected, and especially a little bit of care with our plant selection to make sure that we are establishing plants that are going to thrive in this dynamic soil moisture condition. A rain garden is not no maintenance. We often think of rain gardens as being, in the long term, low maintenance as compared to traditionally managed turf or ornamental beds, but it's not no maintenance. We are going to need to check in on this rain garden to make sure it is functioning as intended, infiltrating the water, not having nuisance ponding, and making sure we've got the plant health that we expect in our garden bed, in our rain garden, just like we would in any standard garden bed. And then a rain garden is not a mosquito breeding ground. So we're going to do some investigations and planning to make sure that this rain garden is actually infiltrating the water and that it is dry within a couple days. So the majority of the year, this rain garden is actually going to be dry. It's not going to have surface ponding for longer than a couple days by design. So we're not going to have the opportunity for mosquito habitat to form, because we're going to have proper planning and design on the front end. And to establish our rain garden, we're going to take a lot of cues from nature to make sure we're picking out a plant palette that is going to thrive and be successful in order to give us a whole suite of benefits at multiple scales. So for us as private property owners that own the rain garden, we'll be able to increase our diversity of plants that we're able to have in our landscape because we're going to change those soil and moisture conditions. So we're going to be able to attract a variety of different beneficial insects and pollinators and wildlife to our space. But then at a larger scale, we're going to be providing protection to the watershed and to water quality downstream. So each individual rain garden in each individual yard has the power to mitigate the runoff coming from that space. And then collectively in a neighborhood or a community, that amounts to a whole lot of water being infiltrated into the ground, filtered for any pollutants that might be carried from the landscape into the rain garden, filtered through the soils, filtered through all those healthy roots of our native plants, removing toxins that might be carried into our waterways, into our streams, but then also just dealing with that volume of water instead of allowing it to compound downstream. So at a bigger scale, at the watershed scale, we're doing our part to protect our water quality and protect downstream aquatic resources and habitats against the impact of urban stormwater runoff. So to get started, we need to answer 3 simple questions. Where to build our rain garden? How big is our rain garden going to need to be? And what do we plant in our rain garden? So let's get started on the design process. The first question, where to build, we need to ask ourselves, well, where does our runoff water go? And we have a UT Extension publication on our website that helps us look at our landscape like a raindrop, differentiating between impervious and pervious surfaces, connecting the dots between our downspouts, our topography and flow paths in the landscape, and really making our stormwater map on our property. And this is going to help us prioritize where in the landscape a rain garden would make sense to capture runoff from the impervious surfaces and intercept it before it meets that storm drain or place where it exits your property. Then the next question is going to be, how big of a rain garden do I need? And a lot of that is going to be dealt with depending upon what the contributing area of your rain garden is and some of the soil characteristics. So once we have some areas prioritized for a rain garden, we want to look at the soils. We can simulate the conditions of a rain garden by digging a hole and conducting a perk test. So digging a hole about 12 inches deep, assuming we have that much soil, but as deep as we can, and stacking water in that hole, filling it a couple times, letting it drain to simulate that saturated condition that our rain garden is going to experience, and making sure that that water can get into the ground within a couple days. So conduct a perk test in some of the areas that you've prioritized, and then really to get to the question about how big does our rain garden need to be to capture that volume of water, we're going to take a soil sample, much like we would from our yard if we were interested in knowing what the soil pH is, our fertilizer recommendations. We can also look at our soils and see what the particle size or the texture is. And so we can send our soil sample to the lab and get this particle size analysis completed and receive information on our soil texture. And this is going to help us understand how much infiltration capacity our landscape has based on that soil texture. And infiltration capacity, if we have quicker draining soils, we need a smaller rain garden because it's going to be soaked into the ground really fast. But if we have tighter clay soils, we'll have slower draining soils, slower infiltration rates, and we'll need to spread that water out. And so as you can imagine, we'll need a bigger rain garden. So our sizing rules that we recommend based on soil texture results are that if your result comes back and you're in this nice sandy loam area, you're going to need a rain garden that is about 10% the size of the space that contributes water to it. So I'm going to add up all of the surface areas of the impervious surface that drains to my rain garden space, and then take 10% of that size, and that's the footprint of the rain garden that is needed to capture that water and infiltrate it into the ground over 2 days. If we have tighter clay soils, slower draining soils, we're going to need to spread that water out. Again, we're working with only 3 to 6 inches of ponded water here. And we're going to want to spread that out so that it's a little bit shallower, spread out a little bit more, and we need a bigger rain garden to handle that same volume of water. So our recommendation would be to increase that to 15% of your contributing area would be your rain garden size there. Now, if your soil texture comes back and you've got just really tight clay soils, high clay content, this is probably going to be a red flag and a no-go scenario, and you might want to consider a backyard wetland habitat instead. And so we'll have some resources for that alternative at the end of the talk. So just to kind of see what that looks like in practicality, so how big does our rain garden need to be? We're going to measure the impervious surface area that drains to our area where we're going to put our rain garden. And we're going to take that number and then multiply it by our sizing factor based on that soil texture result. So for those of you guys who don't like equations and don't really feel like doing that math, I hear you. And I've given us a little cheat sheet here. And generally speaking, if we've got 1, 2, or 3 downspouts from a reasonably sized rooftop draining to our rain garden area, we're going to need a rain garden of about 100 square feet. So you can envision a space that's approximately 8 by 12, so a little bit longer than it is wide. If we've got about half of our house plus our driveway, more contributing area, we're going to need a larger rain garden size. So let's bump that up to about 200 square feet. And if we're working at the corner of our property where our whole house is draining that way along with the driveway and some other areas, we might want to maximize the size of our rain garden and really bump that up to about 250 square feet. So let's look at an example here. Here we've got our house. We've done our stormwater flow network. We got outside with our umbrellas and we were able to see where water was flowing when it rained. So we've looked at the downspouts, we've looked at the topography and where water is being shed during rain events. And in this example, we're going to see what size rain garden we need in that upper left corner to capture runoff from one of the downspouts, which this is the surface area of the roof that's draining to the downspout, about this portion of the gravel driveway. And since it is gravel driveway instead of asphalt, we're only going to take a portion of that area that drains to the rain garden site. And then part of this clay hill slope actually contributes runoff to the rain garden site as well. But since it is soil and since there is some vegetation there, some infiltration does happen when it rains, but it definitely sheds water within an inch of rainfall. So we're going to take that in consideration a little bit too. So adding up all those areas, 100% of the rooftop space that drains to our prioritized rain garden spot, about half of the driveway area, and just about 20% of that clayey hill. That comes up with about 600 square feet of effective impervious surface draining to our rain garden. Taking a soil sample, we've got a silty clay loam soil, so we're going to use that bigger sizing factor and take 15% of that. And that gives us a rain garden size target of about 90 square feet. So let's take a look at this site. Here we are at our rain garden. It's capturing runoff that's carried through that downspout, through an underdrain, and sent through a grassy swale into the rain garden. Combining with the runoff, the overland flow that's coming from the hill slope, entering the rain garden, being intercepted by this earthen berm that we created at the low end of the rain garden to act as the rim or the lip of the rain garden, so that water is held in the depression just about 4 to 5 inches of ponded depth here during a rain event. And then in the bigger events, we have our overflow armored with locally sourced rock that we found on site here to guide that overflow water safely away from any infrastructure so we don't cause any problems. And the size of that depression being 8 by 12, capturing the square footage that we needed to for our rain garden to capture about an inch of runoff from our impervious surface, our contributing area. So the only thing that remains is to supplement the plants that are here with some more rain garden plants. So our last question is exactly that. What are we going to plant in the rain garden? So let's talk about plants. Let's talk about what type of native Tennessee plants will thrive in this really dynamic soil moisture condition where they can tolerate the inundation in certain parts of the rain garden, perhaps tolerate wet feet around the edges, but then also in between rain events, the drying out of the soil. And so here is where we definitely are going to take our cues from nature on trying to select for plants that you would typically find around a stream bank or the bank of a wetland, and put those in our rain garden because we know that those plants are naturally adapted to temporary inundation or having wet root systems. So every rain garden is going to be unique, but one of the things that all rain gardens will have in common is a variable soil moisture condition present that needs to be considered when we're picking out our plants and specifically when we're laying them out in the rain garden. So the soil moisture conditions will vary from in the middle of that depression, the wet pool. This is going to be the spot that's going to have the highest soil moisture condition for the longest period of time. So we want to select plants that can really tolerate temporary inundation as well as saturated soil moisture. Around that, we'll have kind of a moderate or mesic environment where temporary inundation, but again, a little bit more drying in between storm events. And then the driest part of our rain garden will likely be on the back side of any earthen berm that we need to create in order to hold that water in and create that bowl. So these soils won't experience the inundation or the high soil moisture condition. And actually, since they are relatively disturbed as we're packing that earthen berm in, we're likely going to have very dry soil conditions. So we need to take all these into consideration as we select our plants and as we place them in our rain garden. Garden bed planning, we also want to consider bloom time, not only for the aesthetics and giving ourselves something different to look at during different parts of the year and really reflecting the seasonality in our landscape, but also how do we want to support pollinators and other beneficial wildlife in our landscape through our plant selection. So creating a chart like this that incorporates bloom time or seasonal foliar colors, as well as our soil moisture conditions, where those plants are going to be in the footprint of our rain garden, will help us make sure that we've hit both of those targets, addressing soil moisture condition, as well as our bloom times, our aesthetics, and supporting pollinators over the course of the year. We have a recommended plant list for rain gardens in Tennessee posted on our website, as well as a link to a project in iNaturalist where we have put all these species and put the boundary of Tennessee and collected observations from users across the state to kind of showcase what some of these native rain garden plants look like in a variety of different landscapes. You can also see some rain garden plants firsthand at the Discovery Gardens Rain Garden right there in Crossville, Tennessee, established by Master Gardeners and UT Extension in 2013. And just like with all gardening projects, it's going to take a little bit of time and patience for your rain garden to establish, and it's going to be a very dynamic situation, especially working with natives that have a tendency to reseed or perhaps move about in the rain garden a little bit based on where they're trying to find their optimal condition. So documenting where you plant the plants is a big help when spring comes around and some of those perennials are coming out, being able to differentiate between what should stay and what might need to be weeded. And then do expect the first couple years for that weed pressure to be relatively high as your plants are finding their space, moving around, and coming to full plant canopy. But after a few years, those natives should take hold, thrive, and fill the space, and hopefully that weed pressure will be reduced. And if a rain garden is simply out of your reach because you have too tight of clay soils or an area of a high water table, then consider a backyard wetland habitat instead.
So instead of that rainwater runoff infiltrating into the ground as it would in a rain garden, instead that water stays at the surface long enough to support native wetland plants, many of which will attract a wide variety of wildlife to your backyard, like dragonflies, damselflies, other pollinators, and then you can even see some frogs and maybe even some turtles.
If you think a backyard wetland habitat is right for you, then please access our recommended plant list at the website tiny.utk.edu/utwetlands. And for more information on rain gardens, you can find it all at tnyards.utk.edu. Thanks for joining this session, and I'll leave you with a quote from Aldo Leopold that I think really reflects the journey you can have in your landscape as you establish a rain garden. Our ability to perceive quality in nature begins as in art with the pretty. It expands through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language. Happy rain gardening, folks!